Whether you realize it or not, you already use persuasive speaking every day. You do it when you convince your friend to go along with you on some crazy adventure. You do it when you convince your boss to give you the schedule that you want. And you do it anytime you interview for a job. In fact, when economists analyze how many careers are based on persuading, it represents 26% of the U.S. gross domestic product. That means that's how much the role of persuasion is in creating money in our economy. Beyond that, we're all bombarded by persuasive messages every day. Since this is the case, it's important that we know and understand persuasion in case we need to do it in real life or to be more critical in how we respond to other people's persuasive messages. So in this lecture, we're going to go over some basics related to persuasive speaking. Specifically, we're going to talk about what persuasion is, the psychology of persuasion, some types of persuasive speeches, and the organizational patterns that go with persuasive speaking. So let's get started by talking about what persuasion is. Persuasion is the process of trying to create, reinforce, or change people's beliefs or their actions. When you attempt to persuade someone, you act as an advocate. That means that you're trying to get your listeners to agree with you or to act on a belief that you have. Your goal might be to defend an idea, to refute an opponent that you have, to sell a program, or to inspire people to act on something. In order to persuade your audience, you're going to need to use all the skills that you learned in informative speaking. So we have to inform people on topics before we can persuade them. But you're also going to need to learn some new skills on how to impact your listeners' attitudes, values, and beliefs. One of the first of those skills is understanding the psychology of persuasion. While audience analysis was important in an informative speech, you can't be successful at all in a persuasive speech if you're not really thinking about where the audience stands on your issues. So getting inside your audience's head and knowing how to move them is important in a persuasive speech. Also, knowing who your audience is may affect what your goal of speaking is. For example, if my audience strongly disagrees with my position, I might be successful in a persuasive speech if I can just get them to open up their mind a little to my topic or agree with one point that I make. While if my audience is mildly in favor of my topic, I want to try to get them to actually take an action related to my topic. The way I go about persuasion is going to change tremendously based on whether my audience is more in agreement or disagreement with me. Ultimately, my goal is to get my audience to move more towards my position. That doesn't mean that they totally agree. It just means that I've moved them a little bit. In order to get your audience to move their position, you have to think of the persuasive speech as a mental give and take between you and your audience at all times. Your audience isn't passive. They're thinking about and considering everything that you say. In other words, you're kind of having a psychological conversation with them. They're going back and forth with you as you go through your speech. You're not going to actually be hearing them, so that means you need to anticipate what they're going to be thinking about everything you present in the speech. You need to kind of predict what the mental dialogue is. This means in the speech, you need to not only predict the dialogue, but handle it by talking about potential objections in your speech. I like to call this planning for objections. You know that as you say certain things, you're going to have a group of your audience that objects. So you want to try to go ahead and counteract how they object to you. So you can see how persuasive speaking really involves trying to think and get in people's heads, understanding their attitudes, values, and beliefs. So now that you've learned the first skill of really looking at the mental give and take of the psychology of your audience, let's talk about the different types of persuasive speeches. The The types of persuasive speeches are centered around 3 different questions that you might be trying to persuade somebody about. Whether something is true or not, and we call that a question of fact speech. Whether something is good or bad, right or wrong, and we call that a question of value speech. And then what direction we should be taking or action we should be taking. We call that a question of policy speech. Let's start with question of fact speeches. Question of fact speeches are about whether something is true or false, but you don't know for sure whether it's true or false. Sounds confusing? Let's look at a couple of examples. We might do a question of fact speech about who's going to win the Super Bowl, or was there really a moon landing, or will the economy be better or worse in the fall? The key here is no one knows the final answer, and you're trying to convince the audience of your answer of what's true or not. Sometimes students see a question of fact speech as an informative speech. They're just giving information. But the difference is in an informative speech, you're not taking a position. In a persuasive speech, you are taking a position on the facts and trying to convince your audience. The way to think about this is there a dispute over the facts or not? If there's no dispute over the facts, you're really giving an informative speech. If there's a dispute over the facts and you're going to take a position on your audience with the facts, then it's persuasive. When it comes to organizational patterns, questions of fact speeches are usually organized in a topical organization pattern. The second type of persuasive speech is the question of value. You're making judgments about what's right or wrong, good or bad, moral or immoral, proper or improper. So let's look at some examples here. We might look at whether solitary confinement is moral or immoral. We might look at whether wearing a mask is moral relative to COVID-19. These are just a couple of examples of value speeches. See that better, good, right, wrong in there? In questions of value speeches, you have to justify your claim. You have to give support and evidence of why the way that you're recommending is best. For example, if I say that bicycling is the best form of transportation, I have to give you reasons why that's a true statement in order to convince you. Or in Professor Bernhardt's case, why Tom Brady is better than Aaron Rodgers. In order to prove a claim or justify that something is right or wrong or best, you need to evaluate it versus other standards. So in my Tom versus Aaron speech, my standards are going to be certain football statistics, how many Super Bowl wins they have, and then their general overall playing wins and losses. Question of value speeches are almost always organized topically. And usually, the first main point sets forth the standards and why your standards matter. And the second main point measures whatever you're saying is better or best against those standards. One note on standards. The standards have to be something that in general people agree on. You can't just make up your own standards or your audience is going to just throw your argument out. In other words, you don't want to have to argue in your speech that your standards are correct. So if you notice so far in our question of fact and question of value speeches, we really haven't tried to get anybody to do anything or take an action. We've just asked them to kind of mentally agree with us. A speech in which we ask our audience to take a specific action is a question of policy speech. In this type of speech, we're recommending a specific course of action by our audience. We want them to do something as a result of our speech. So let's look at some topics that are question of policy speeches. For example, where to go on your next vacation, whether or not to buy a new laptop, which movie to see this weekend, whether or not you should buy a certain product, all question of policy speeches. Here's the twist. Sometimes in question of policy speeches, we have to discuss whether or not facts are true or not, or whether something is moral or not. So that means that our policy speech can really include all three types of persuasive speeches. But what makes it a policy speech is we're asking our audience to take a specific action. We're telling them that something should or should not be done. In a question of policy speech, when you recommend your action to your audience, it needs to be specific as possible. It's not just a general, you should go out and do something. You should tell them exactly what you want them to do. For example, in a speech on the Red Cross, do you want them to donate blood? Do you want them to give money to the Red Cross? Do you want them to volunteer for the Red Cross? Be specific. And remember, this telling them what you want to do is called the call to action in your persuasive speech. And you should make sure that you end your speech with the strong call to action. There are three main elements that you absolutely have to address in a question of policy speech. That's the need for the change, your plan for the change, and how your plan is practical to the audience. So let's talk about the need for change more in detail. We have to show our audiences that there is a serious problem. And the way we do that is by giving them facts and statistics that show the need for change. So what if I'm giving a speech that says there is no need for change? Then in that case, I'm going to show them how things are working well as they are. After you've established your need, now it's time to share with your audience what your plan is. This means that you're going to tell them how you're going to solve the problem. So you're going to give them the major features of your plan. Once you've presented your plan, you're going to show your audience how your plan is practical. So what that means is, does your plan create more problems or does it solve all the problems? In proving that your plan is practical, you're going to show your audience that your plan works. One way you can do this is by showing evidence from other places that have had similar plans that worked. You can provide this as evidence for your speech. I can also show how my plan is more cost effective, or maybe even how it's more efficient. It works better and quicker. As a reminder, when you're using evidence from other places that a plan has been implemented, make sure they're as close to the situation with your audience as possible. What I mean by this is your evidence wouldn't come from Australia, it would come from somewhere in the US. Or if there was a municipality in Texas or California, you would choose Texas. Speeches of policy are organized in a number of different ways. The most common ones are problem solution, problem cause solution, comparative advantages, and Monroe's motivated sequence. The first persuasive organizational pattern is problem solution. This is basically when, in your first main point, you talk about the problem in the speech, and in the second main point, you talk about how you're going to solve the problem. Pretty simple. The next type of organizational pattern is problem cause solution. And you use problem cause solution when the causes of solution are in debate. So whether there's debate over the truth of the causes of a problem. A great example of this is the topic of global warming. Some people think global warming is just a natural phenomena and that's what causes. Others believe it's human caused. So in a speech on global warming, we need to convince our audience, if we're going to ask them to make changes, that it's actually caused by humans. So the next type of organizational pattern is comparative advantage. And this is where you're going to compare two solutions. You use this organizational pattern when your audience already agrees that there's a problem. You don't need to talk about the problem because everybody knows there is one. So if we said traffic in Houston is a problem, almost all of us are going to agree. But we might not agree on the ways to solve it, either a bus system or a rail system. So your speech would all be about saying one system is better than the other system. For example, in this slide, I basically say that a rapid bus system is better than a rail system. So in a comparative advantage speech, your main points deal with
why your idea is better than other ideas.
The final format or organizational pattern is Monroe's motivated sequence, and we're going to talk about it in a later unit. So now you have a high-level overview of the topic of persuasion. You've learned a little bit about what it is, the psychological process behind it, some different types of persuasive speeches, and some organizational patterns in persuasive speeches. Truly, this is just the tip of the iceberg on persuasion. And in our next video, we're going to learn about some strategies on how to convince people.
So have a great day, and thank you.